I'm very concerned for how people in my community feel these days, what I see, and what I see as a lot of trauma, disappointment, disconnection, and trying to understand how Muslims can once again center themselves and to understand what they're supposed to do in this very complicated world in which we live. I see confusion about so many things, about political ethics and decisions. In the medical field, I've been working on bioethics in the area of gender and rights, in the area of the environment, and just people who are marginalized and displaced all over. And one of the things that I notice as I've been contemplating these areas and thinking about them again and again is the importance and the place of the body. And so I'm trying to look tonight really at the body as the place that we need to spend some time focusing on and understanding the importance of being embodied people and what that means in Islam. I think of this, one of the reasons why I've thought about this is also my confusion about so many actions where I see so-called idealistic people who engage in horrendous actions, people who have high ideals engaging in real harm against real people. And this is the reason why I say let's get real, because I think we need to argue for a recommitment to the primacy of the embodied person. To be against idealism in the philosophical sense, not in the common sense or common usage sense of the term of trying to achieve something better or believing that society can be better than it has been. We need to be idealistic in the sense of wanting something better for ourselves and for others. A community and individuals should have principles and values, as well as a vision of what it would like to achieve. To be against idealism is also not to be against normativity. It is instead to be against a utopian vision, an ideal society in the sense of looking at things and issues and people as a kind of Platonic, essentialized thing rather than actual subjects in and of themselves. I notice that it is the most idealistic people in the sense who become the most bitterly disappointed in human institutions because people are not ideas, they are bodies in space and time. It's these people who also can become the most disappointed in themselves and lead to a situation where they are dissociate from their own selves and their own visceral selves, their bodies, leading to destruction of themselves. We've seen in the last few days in the news this conference on countering violent extremism. And I see a lot of talk about ideas. It is not my sense from talking with some people who have been engaged in this, caught up by, or whose friends have been caught up by these actions, that it is necessarily just about ideas. Why is it that converts and those who are newly religious, Muslims who are newly religious, the criminals, the gangsters, the thugs, or all the derogatory words that have been used with respect to people who had tough lives and engaged in some kind of compensatory behavior, criminal behavior, why is it that they're so vulnerable to these kind of movements? And I believe it has a great deal to do with the hatred of the memory that is carried within their bodies of what they have done and what has been done to them. Why does someone want to go to a place where there's a very strong risk of their body being destroyed. And I heard a story about a young man from my students, a young man who in fact did this, who left Canada and went to fight and was killed. And what I was told is that he was one of the guys, one of the teenagers, Muslim teenagers, who used to go out and used to party until a bunch of them decided, you know what, we've probably done enough of this, we should probably get a little bit religious. And they all got a little bit religious. Not, you know, they still were not perfect, but they said, let's stop some of the things. Let's stop drinking alcohol and let's stop partying with women. And he couldn't. My student said this guy couldn't, and he felt so disgusted by himself that he felt the only way that he could stop from being condemned to hellfire for his sins was to go and put himself in that place. So I want us really to think about what this means, to be an embodied person, and what it compels us to do, and how that relates to our ethics. Now, some may ask, don't Muslims already focus too much on the body, you know, with our concerns about sexuality and hijab and beards and these kind of things? I think there is a selective focus and attention. It's not that I see any of that as superficial or unnecessary. And it is one of the strengths of the Islamic legal tradition that importance is given to certain desires. But it is selective. And certainly there is a privileging of certain bodies. I mean, if we look, and I don't have to, with Keisha Ali in the audience, who's an expert in this, I should bring her up to talk about what I would call the jurisprudential gymnastics that are done to accommodate the sexual taste, preferences, and desires of privileged heterosexual men in our tradition, and continues until today. We all know about the fatwas that give permission for so-called vacation marriages, men marrying with the intention to divorce, even though temporary marriage isn't allowed, but he wants citizenship or to have a sexual outlet, taking a second wife in secret, not telling his first wife. So if we look at all of the accommodations made for the sake of a realistic view of the needs of a certain kind of body, and contrast that with the refusal to find any way to accommodate or ease the real suffering of many other categories of people, single women, migrant workers who cannot have any of their family with them, homosexual Muslims, we see that there is a great selectivity. And this isn't just about men, but we could also look at elite women who are assured that they have no obligation to perform the tiring and boring housework, cooking, or even taking care of children. But then the question is, who does the work? Non-elite women whose bodies are exposed and overworked and separated from the embraces of their children and their husbands. So a pragmatic or realistic approach is taken when considering the needs and bodies of the privileged, but not of so many others. So we have to be very honest about the narratives we tell of ourselves. We talk about how the media frames news, how the misdeeds of some people receive a great deal of attention while others are ignored, how some narratives are used to elicit sympathy towards certain human lives and certain human needs and not others, the whole Islamophobic discourse. But we have also selective narratives and a dehumanization that can occur within our communities, and we need to be aware of that and begin to take a more, well, we'll talk about how we get those other narratives in, and it isn't by asking other people to remember us. That's for sure, I could preempt that. But let's look back, before we enter into that, really look at this issue of the body and why it is so important and why it's not some kind of, just we're talking about it because it's some kind of feminist trope or some new aspect that we're introducing into Islamic thought. Not that there would be anything wrong with that whatsoever. But this is at the heart of what it means to be a person in Islam. We can begin with this parable that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, told to his companions. He said there was a man who had never done a pious deed in his life. So he said to his children, "When I die, burn me to ashes and divide the ashes into 2 parts. Scatter one part on the land and the other in the ocean. By God, if my Lord gets a hold of this body, he will punish it like never before." When the man died, his children obeyed his instructions, but God commanded the land to gather his ashes. So the land collected every particle of his ashes from itself. Then God commanded the ocean, and it too gathered all the particles, even from its depths. Then God asked him, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "My Lord, out of fear of you." So God forgave him. Now, Muslim preachers and theologians derive a number of lessons from this parable, the most important of which is that the mercy of God is without limit. God is unconstrained by the human conception of justice and judgment, including a person's self-assessment of being utterly worthless. Some theologians would suggest that the man was forgiven for his evil actions because although he was a consistent sinner, he did not disbelieve in God. Indeed, he took extensive action to disappear precisely because he recognized God's authority to judge and punish him. The man's failure to act morally was less important than his acknowledgement of God and God's divinely established moral order. I think actually Dr. Jackson has a beautiful short article. What's it called? About the man who's punished for alcohol, drinking alcohol.
I forgot.
You forgot the article. It's beautiful, and I think there's a similar message here. So as we consider, this issue, for our purposes, I would like to draw attention here beyond mercy, beyond love of God, to the centrality of the body in this parable. The man sees his body as the locus of God's judgment, which he wishes to escape. Hence his desperate strategy to make his body disappear after death. God, of course, is fully capable of reconstituting any part of his creation, no matter how dissipated it is. But it is only upon the reconstruction and reanimation of the body that the man comes back into existence. The person is there when the body is there, capable of engaging in an audience with God. The person is present when the body is present. The Quran describes in vivid terms the bodily and emotional pleasures of heaven and the torments of hell. Now, whether it's possible for a person to conceive of himself or herself as existing as a disembodied spirit, the Quran leaves no doubt that the person who experiences the afterlife is the same man or woman one identifies as self today. Judgment, however, must precede the ultimate reward or punishment, and at this juncture, the Quran describes people having a kind of dissociative experience, whereby they become mute, while their limbs and organs gain the ability to speak in order to serve as witnesses to the person's action. God says, "On that day we shall set a seal on their mouths and make their hands speak to us, and their feet will bear witness to what they have done." In light of such passages, perhaps we could see the man in the parable who wanted his body burned and ashes scattered to have been hoping not only to avoid the bodily punishments of the afterlife, he also wanted to destroy the evidence. Here we might see another moral of the story after the first lesson, which is that God will ultimately be, that a person will ultimately be judged by an external subject that is God, and it is God's judgment that is supreme, not the person's. And the second lesson, that after his judgment, God's mercy will prevail. But what is further implied in the story is the message that there is no escape from the body until that time. In life and until the final judgment, there is no flight from a body that constantly reminds a person of what it has done and what has been done to it. The body is the reality from which one cannot dissociate. at least not for long. The major scholars of Islam have agreed that belief in the resurrection of the dead is a necessary part of faith. For example, the 12th century theologian Al-Ghazali argued, along with others, that philosophers such as Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, who adopted a Platonic mind-body dualism and argued that only the soul survived after death, should be considered unbelievers. Now, while they argued against this, at the same time, the majority of dogmatic scholars asserted that the nafs is a soul that can separate from the body. Now, here I can't get into a long, very complicated history of discussions about the difference, or is there a difference between the soul and the spirit, the nafs and the ruh, and what they are. But let's say in a book like Ibn Qayyim's Kitab al-Ruh, he mostly conflates the two terms. As for the Quran does not define nafs so much as refer to it, and thus remains ambiguous and open to a range of interpretations. And when it comes to the state of the person after death, but before the resurrection, the Quran displays a noticeable lack of interest. The main focus of the Quran instead is the resurrection and re-embodiment of the person, since it is this which makes the divine judgment of persons possible. Islamic discourse outside of the Quran, in contrast, is rich with discussions of the state of the pre-resurrected dead. The literature reflects a deep level of concern about this liminal state, a concern that's widely displayed across Islamic cultures through the attention paid to burial rituals, as well as the contentious debate over visitation practices and the intercession of the saintly dead. And if you want to really see how different forms of knowledge are introduced into Islamic discourse in a very interesting way, I would suggest reading an unedited. It's not easy. There are no good translations of Kitab al-Ruh by Ibn Qayyim. But even in the faulty ones, you see that he suddenly allows for a wide range of sources of knowledge that he would otherwise dismiss. So for example, the fact that people see spirits after death. He says there's no evidence of this in the Quran or the Sunnah, but you know what? So many good people say they've seen it. You can't deny it. So this kind of liberal letting in order to tell a good story or to bring a good moral to people is quite clear. So there's no doubt that a certain dualism of body and soul dominates most Islamic discourses. This is not a dualism, however, that degrades the body. It is, even in Sufi discourses, that's the case. Valerie Hoffman says, as for the Quran itself, it does not speak of a body, spirit, or body-soul dichotomy as the problem behind the evils of human existence. The cause of human abasement is not, in Quranic language, the flesh, but pride and self, greed, and deception of Satan, who whispers his temptations to receptive humans. So ascetic practices are generally limited to enhance spiritual awareness, not to punish an evil body. And here there's a clear difference between classical Christian thought and classical Islamic thought, where Christian thought sees the body as part of matter, and in a dualistic Platonic view sees the body as inferior to the soul and as corrupt. In Sufism, or in some forms of Sufism, where it is encouraged to inflict some discomfort on the body, and it's justified, it's not because the body is evil, but because this is a way to discipline the inner self, which directs the body. So in this sense, ego mortification rather than flesh mortification is the goal. But for the external observer, the impression that is given is of punishment to the body. Extreme forms of bodily denial to tame an evil nafs, or an evil self or soul or ego have not gone unchallenged in Muslim society. The majority of Muslims, including most Sufis, have rejected extreme practices as contrary to the example of the Prophet and his companions. Asceticism for the majority means moderation and simplicity of lifestyle. But here we turn to ethical reasoning. What does moderation and simplicity mean? These are relative terms, and the places where we see a concept like moderation invoked need to have some attention paid to them. If we look at, at this conference, we had a lot of talk, and we'll have more tomorrow, about halal food and the expansion of halal to the Taib food market, or the Islamic food market that includes not only how the animal is slaughtered, but how the animal is raised and treated from the time, how it's treated its whole life. And it could also include what is done to the earth or the environment on which the animal is raised, the workers who are involved in the process. So this is a holistic approach. We could call this supply chain ethics, and it's something that you could easily learn about by going to your local Whole Foods and looking at the numbering system for the different levels of meat, number 1 to up to 5, or at least that was my local Whole Foods. The best is number 5, where all of these factors are taken into account. Now, it might seem that this supply chain ethics is a new hipster phenomenon, but actually it's part of Islamic theological ethical discourse from the beginning. The concept of blocking the means in Islamic ethics. If we look at Ahmed ibn Hanbal's Kitab al-Wara, where he says that things like even if you're in a mosque and you notice that someone is burning incense that was donated by a prince or some authority who got the money from stolen property, that you should hold your breath and run out of the mosque so you don't breathe in this smoke, this incense that originated through a kind of supply chain back to unlawful wealth. So he was, if you want to go back to supply chain ethics, Kitab al-Wara is all about that. Imam Abu Hanifa as well, when he was asked, why did you not write a book of wara, wara is righteousness, he responded, I wrote a book of commerce instead. So this is a different aspect of being very realistic about things and about the supply chain, or the lawfulness not only of what you have but where it came from. So following that chain of transmission back to something good. Of course, not everyone's interests and concerns are given the same attention in these books. There are certain things that are prioritized and others that are not. But here you could say, here is a discourse that really is rooted in the body, in what you consume, in what you breathe, in what you bring into your home. So there is a very strong tradition here. But I want to make another point, a kind of side point before I go on with this, is that just my advice as we go forward in this Islamic ethical discourse and develop it, is that when we talk about things like supply chain ethics, we really need to distinguish priorities from tactic, or principles from tactics and priorities. As someone who as a teenager boycotted grapes from Chile, apples from South Africa, and chocolate from Nestle, those of you who grew up at the same time as me know why all those companies were boycotted, because of the exploitation of the workers and apartheid in South Africa. I know what it means to be a very enthusiastic activist in this area, and how annoying that can be to your parents, and also how that can divide people who live together. I think we have to be very careful about litmus tests that are set by activists and those with an ethical outlook. And the litmus test it's not only a litmus test that this cause is the cause that defines righteousness or purity or sincerity lack of hypocrisy, but also as if their cause is the only one that should be prioritized. So we have to distinguish the principles, which are justice and equality, from tactics, like boycotts, and from perspectives, i.e. that this cause must be the priority, and if you abandon this cause or you don't care about this, then it means that you really don't care, you really don't have faith. It is a form of hypocrisy. So with ethical reasoning, we need to try to take into account as many relevant concerns as possible in time to make a decision. We have to make decisions. But what are some of those concerns? Those concerns also include things like maintaining relationships. Dr. Jackson talked about that Islam can't be reduced to the law. And certainly ethics isn't all of Islam. Ethics is a form of law or a form of legal reasoning, but it is not all of Islam. So we look at when the Quran says something like, "Hal jaza al-ihsan ila al-ihsan." Someone is the reward for kindness or a kindness or goodness towards you anything else than goodness towards that person? How often are those who cut off or are rude to those who don't sign on to their cause? And here I'll just give a personal aside. My daughter, Sumaya, who was much more enthusiastic supply chain ethicist even at 12 or 13 years old than I ever was, and was a vegetarian, very, very strict about this, strongly believed in it. Later in her life, she became very ill, and she's been many years now very sick and quite isolated, bedridden. But her mind is as sharp as anything, and she's really my sheikh. She's taught me so much. And she said to me, she was talking to me the other day, and she said, "Remember when I lived with a wonderful woman, a widow from Syria, who took her into her home. We used to live with her, and then when Sumaya wanted to go back to Chicago to school, she let her live with her for a year. And by that time, Sumaya was a vegetarian. And how poor Khala Adila, she would keep giving Sumaya dishes of food, and she's the best cook in the whole city. And Sumaya would say, "But I'm a vegetarian, I can't eat that." And she said, "Well, it's not meat, it's just little pieces, and with the rice and the peas." She's like, "But that's meat, I can't eat meat." And Sumaya was saying to me, I really wish I hadn't been like that my relationship with her is the thing that is more important to me now than she said, why couldn't I just have let it go for her? And really understanding in a more holistic way, not that she should have not been vegetarian, but understanding here, this food was not just meat, it was love, attention, care, it was a relationship. It's not just about food in a bag, as it were, or a dish, but about eating together, about having this relationship with each other. So it's very difficult. How do we understand how to place all of these concerns? And as I say, we have to be very careful about terms like extreme and moderate, because the response of those who do not want to care about these things is to say that's too extreme, Muslims are moderate. Or, as I've heard before, Muslims aren't supposed to be dusty dervishes. When you argue against consumerism, I literally heard that term, as if to argue for some moderation means that we are resorting to some kind of extreme form of asceticism. But we have to realize that we live in a time in particular, and this is where this idea of moderation really is almost a meaningless term now, because the reality is that consumption in our time simply is not like consumption in other times. Rather, it is more fraught with moral peril due to the nature of some of the goods and products that have been developed in modernity and the methods by which they've been produced. At times, it seems like the poor of the world have, since the rise of the modern period, been subject to an ongoing experiment without their consent, to see how their labor and land could best be exploited to improve the lifestyles of privileged individuals and communities across the world, and more substantially, to further the economic interests of the politically dominant nations, including our own. Greed, selfishness, and avarice, of course, are not distinctly modern characteristics. These are human failings to which all people are subject, the ancients and the moderns, the illiterate and the most educated. Our time, however, is characterized, among other things, by the rapid development of new technologies and the reorganization of social structures and the intensive exploitation of the environment to optimize the use and impact of such technologies. New technologies, materials, and methods of production are introduced with dizzying speed and with the coercive power of modern nation states, and are sometimes imposed on whole populations in a very short period. Now, very often these things bring significant improvements to people's lives. The cash earned from export crops is used to advance the development of an economy. Technology frees children from the burden of laboring and makes it possible for them to be educated when schools are available. There's no doubt that plastic buckets, food containers, and medical supplies have significantly contributed to improved health and hygiene across the world. We've only realized lately, however, that many of these products, which in themselves are beneficial, result from a manufacturing process that generates noxious wastes. Further, when many of these products are broken or replaced by more advanced models, they become pollution because they do not biodegrade. Before the development of synthetic products, every man-made object would or could eventually degrade back into the earth. That's why you can find people, sites where people have lived for 3,000 years in the Near East, and they were able to live one on top of the other, and all they left behind are the little shards or sherds and dust of their previous existence. Not anymore. Those places are all filled with water bottles. What is saddest and most sinful in all of this is that the millions of poor people across the world experience few or none of the benefits of modern industry and agricultural methods, but they suffer the most directly from their toxic outflows. I remember when we went to Indonesia with the Nawawi Foundation, passing through the countryside in Java, through very small villages along waterways. The inhabitants evidently own very few of the modern products that can improve health and well-being. They did not have well-roofed and screened homes to keep out the rain and mosquitoes. They did not have a medical clinic or sturdy footwear. At the same time, these people had been robbed of any kind of pristine or bucolic rural environment that offers its own benefits. Their stream, for example, was clogged with plastic garbage and poisoned by the industrial chemicals produced by factories far upstream. And we see this in America too. South side of Chicago, where I used to live, that's where the garbage is incinerated, and the toxic outflow from that falls on the population there. Consumption and material progress in the modern age therefore poses, just like warfare and terrorism, challenges that are qualitatively different than those posed in pre-modernity. Terrorism, for example, is not new. It's well known that the term assassin has its origins in the Ismaili extremists who were dedicated to overthrowing the Abbasid Caliphate. The assassins would often sneak into crowded public mosques during Friday services to kill officials with their daggers. Of course, as soon as they attacked, they themselves were killed by guards of the crowd, so these were essentially suicide attacks. However, the damage to human life was always limited because a single person can kill a limited number of people with a dagger. Contrast this with our modern age, where a single person can kill hundreds of people with an explosive vest, or even thousands by releasing a poisonous vapor into a crowded public place. More restrictive security measures, or more robust security measures, can certainly be justified when the harm that would be caused by such an attack is so vast. Similarly, no pre-modern human product or form of manufacturing could ever have caused anything near the damage to people, water, fish, and birds, and the rest of the environment that the Chernobyl nuclear disaster of 1986 caused. One could insist that more nuclear power plants are currently needed to meet our power consumption needs, but we could also insist that there's an ethical imperative to reduce our power consumption, even if we can afford to pay for it. And this is where we get to the problem with fatwas. Fatwas that reduce complex problems to ideal types. So there is no, to say something like, is it lawful to use electricity? Of course it's lawful, but there's no electricity. There are just actual forms of electricity. They're actual electrical generation. There's no beef in an ideal or essential sense. There are only specific cuts of beef. So here, where we return, we see the fatwa literature is completely incapable of dealing with these issues because they constantly revert to ideals and not to actual situations. Or even when they refer to they believe they refer to actual situations, they are not. They are still idealized or generalized forms of questioning. And if this is the case, and here I think where Dr. Jackson and I agree, is that our scholarly tradition, our Sharia tradition, is not capable of dealing with many of these things, that the methodology has something to contribute, but it really is outside of the authority, understanding, ability of the Sharia tradition to deal with this. People, ordinary people, the people who are affected by these need to set their own limits. But religious leaders still have a role. And I believe their role primarily is to remind us of the morality upon which these rights are established, and to narrate and preach a moral vision that for Muslims is based in the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. How do we even embody a sense that, or embody a commitment to do these things? It is by learning them through a kind of imaginative exercise and through storytelling. And preaching really is that. Preaching is the narrative and the stories that we hear mostly. And so here we can, the ability of preachers to reference Quranic verses that talk about the consumption of wholesome things. O you who believe, do not make unlawful the wholesome things that God has made lawful for you, but commit no excess. For God does not love those given to excess. O children of Adam, wear your beautiful apparel at every time and place, and eat and drink, but do not waste, or do not be excessive. For God does not love the wasteful. Every time I read this, God does not love the wasteful, I'm terrified, because we are the most wasteful people. And to say God, it's a very strong language. God does not love those who are wasteful. So I think we need reminders of that. We need reminders because we love stuff. We love to buy stuff. We love to get stuff. We love to say that, hey, we love to quote the first part of the verse. Do not make unlawful the wholesome things that God has made lawful to you, but we just leave the other part off. So we need narrations of these. We need to be reminded of these things. We need to be reminded of the spiritual teachings that Islam recognizes that desire, if not controlled by intellect and conscience, can be insatiable. The Prophet Muhammad said, if the son of Adam had a mountain of gold, he would wish for another. We are consumed with desire for things. But if we seek our happiness in those things, if we confuse our satisfying our desires with happiness, then we're seeking happiness in a mirage. It's in our own spiritual benefit then to realize that things of this world are not ends in themselves, but they can be useful, and that what we need to seek is the face of God. As those who say in the Quran, we feed you seeking the face of God. We wish from you no reward or thanks. One of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings is that is particularly compelling from a spiritual and psychological perspective in this respect is, when you see someone who has more, look to one who has less. Here we have a double movement, beginning with the elicitation of desire and envy, provoked by seeing someone who has a thing which one lacks oneself. Feeling this rising desire within oneself, an initial state for which we are not necessarily responsible, the believer must take the deliberate, moral, and spiritually sound action of moving his or her gaze from what he or she has not to the one who has even less. Now, envy and desire for more things should subside, leading to a greater satisfaction in one's own state. Beyond satisfaction, compassion for the one who has less. Compassion can lead to further action to help the person who is relatively deprived. But this looking is a gaze, and a gaze is a physical action. We turn our heads, we turn our eyes. It means we pay attention to the people who are beside us, who we walk by. I was in Minnesota a couple years ago, and it was the place where the Republicans had their national convention. And they told me that when, before the convention was in town, they insisted that the city put up it was almost like a curtain. They were dividers in front between the sidewalk and the convention where all of the homeless people were, so that the people coming to the convention didn't have to look at the homeless people on the street. So if we refuse to look, unless we decide to turn and look, we can't begin this process of controlling our desires and of engendering compassion towards others. It means that we need to take that action. But we also need to understand that, and here I'm not going to have much time for it, but I want to go back to my question at the beginning about people who sacrifice themselves, who leave this country or leave their countries, leave their communities, or even turn against their communities for the sake of the Muslim community, the Muslim Ummah, the greater community. One of the things that they refer to is this statement of the Prophet Muhammad when he said that the simile of the believers in regard to mutual love, affection, and fellow feeling is that of one body. When any limb of it aches, the whole body aches because of sleeplessness and fever. Now, this really is extremely profound because psychologists have shown that, in fact, when people identify other people as part of them or as part of the same group, that watching that group, even by television, even distantly, watching harm being inflicted is a form of secondary trauma to themselves. As long as there's an identification with that person will begin to experience physiological symptoms of trauma. And I think we see it in a lot of our American Muslim community who spend a lot of time watching traumatized Muslims who are being hurt and beaten. So it isn't just a question of identity. It's not just an idea. It's not just that we have this idea of the Ummah that is about identity. It's about a physical feeling to really take seriously the idea that the body, the community that is a body, the communal body, is also a body to which we're connected, and how profound that is. We live in this time of great displacement due to political, environmental, economic instability and disparities. Many feel uprooted and distant from the place they consider their home as a result of forced migration. Others move easily in search of economic opportunities without ever grounding themselves deeply in the place that they live. The tremendous movement of people in the 21st century has been a challenge to nationalism, an ideology that depends on subscribing to a mythical narrative of a unified people. Multiculturalism has been attacked as a failed response to nationalism on the ground that it does not provide norms for common action and interests. The doctrine of shared values, promoted by many policymakers in response to the perceived failure of multiculturalism, is mostly presented in a jingoistic manner with little substance. And here is where I believe, again, returning to the body and thinking about habitat, not homeland, is important. thinking about neighborliness, not patriotism, is important. To return to the statement that the Prophet gave Aisha when she said, I have something to give away and I have 2 neighbors, to which one should I give it? He said, to the one whose door is closer. This is about measuring inches, you know, whose door is closer, a profound sense of being grounded in a particular place and space. I believe that a return to looking at our identity as in the place where we are, what our ethical and moral responsibilities are, paying attention, looking, turning our heads, is the thing that will make us feel grounded, is what will allow us to regain our ethics. At the same time, not being parochial. Because if we do focus on the body, it does mean that we return to that supply chain. It does mean that we care about the clothes that are made in Bangladesh that we put on our bodies. It does mean that we care about the fruits and vegetables that come from Mexico that we put in our body. So it's not either or. It's not either we're just focused on our nation. I don't think we should be focused primarily on nation. Yes, you follow the law, but that isn't what makes people feel and care about others and do what's needed to make a good and happy and beneficial and wholesome and peaceful society. So we don't do that. We focus on where we are and everything that comes in and everything that goes out as well. This is the one of the problems with the halal consumeristic model. It has an awful lot to do about what comes in, but not what we discard, both from our bodies and from the consumer goods that we use. Finally, and there's so much more to say, but I think a connection between our body and the land is the thing that is really going to be the key. The body of the human being is made from the earth. And the Muslim jurist said that earth is pure, and that means that the bodies of human beings are pure. Imam Shafi'i said, no child of Adam, the body of no child of Adam is impure, and that means that is the thing that unites all people. It unites Muslims with non-Muslims. It unites men and women. And it unites people with the earth, and the earth from which all other creatures come as well. I believe that a deeply embodied and landed return to ethics will be important in helping us overcome some of the false ideologies, false essentials that have plagued our ethical reasoning and legal reasoning. Thank you.